What's going on, Rob? How you doing, man?
I'm doing awesome, Tim.
Good. Good. Glad to see you again. Back
I'm
to our series on transparency. We're going to talk about tenets 3 and 4. Transparency is different from vulnerability, and transparency is different than oversharing. Wow, we could really get into these topics.
we could, in full transparency, I grew my beard because our executive fellows program was last Wednesday. And so there's something about the name of that makes me want to look a little more professorial. So I grew the beard and my wife likes it. She's like, "Oh, I like the beard." Then my son, who's a sophomore in college, immediately goes like, "Yeah, Dad, you look old."
You know
So
what? I mean,
anyway,
that's actually like how I got my beard as well. I was ski season one year and it was cold to only
yeah.
have the goatee. So I grew the beard. And then at the end of it, I went to shave it. My wife was like, no. Like after 15 years, I want to see as least of your face as possible.
That's too good. We'll talk about that later. I have other theories. Okay. What are we talking about now?
Different from vulnerability and different than
Yes.
oversharing.
Yes. Okay, my point. I just, when these tenets, they were all, as I reflected on transparency, I couldn't just wrap it up with a nice little bow. It took like a process of thinking through. And that's how these 10 tenets emerged. But different from vulnerability. So what was interesting was thinking about the relationship between the two. And how so often I think we confuse them as being the same thing. And it's fascinating because the definition of vulnerability is an openness to being hurt.
Mm.
So I think it's possible, the question about, can you be vulnerable and not transparent? Can you be transparent without vulnerable? I think you could be transparent and it may not lead to pain, but it's also that risk. I think it's why it landed in the risky leadership topics, because again, if I share something, sometimes I've overshared. I remember sharing something with a group of students for whom I was responsible. We did this faculty fishbowl in front of like 100 students. And I remember sharing the reason why I thought that my wife and I don't have a third kid. And it was just, I'd never spoken this out loud before. I chose to just let it out in front of all. And then it was interesting. I kind of regretted it afterwards. Because there was too much, there was a lot to unpack. And I think the thing about transparency is whenever we're seen, there's the possibility of vulnerability. You know what I mean? Like if someone can see in, they can see what's going on inside, and who knows what they'll do with that. And but yet we know that vulnerability and some transparency is probably a good thing in many cases.
Well, and I mean, transparency literally involves getting away from the opaque facade, the
Yeah.
facade that we want other people to see about us, right?
Yeah.
And so you do see the cracks, you do see some of the brokenness, some of the imperfection, right?
Yeah.
And
I
I mean,
yeah.
it's kind of foolhardy to think you can go through life and hide all of your imperfection. But I think a lot of leaders try to do it with bravado or machismo or like being larger than life, and you wouldn't broach the subject even if you saw it.
Yeah.
But that actually holds people at an arm's length and doesn't really create trust, right?
Yeah. I'm really curious about your take on something that I don't know if we've ever talked about before. I thought about this, and I know this is a conversation that has some strong feelings around it. But I've thought about schools, and I read some things about how schools were designed. I don't know how long ago, but there was this whole thing around open concepts
Hmm.
and lots of windows, and it was communicating something culturally about transparency, about openness, about light, about all of it. And then all of a sudden we got more information about the dangers of transparency. So it's fascinating because every time I see one of these, it's when you see a school that has a lot of windows, but then surrounded by a wall.
Hmm.
And it's kind of this. I know it even gives me chills thinking about it because I know there are so many feelings around this and what I just brought up transparently, I guess. But from a security perspective, I think about transparency and vulnerabilities all the time. I mean, that's a word you use
For sure.
across your field, right?
Well, and it's a balance too, right? The more open and inviting you want a space to be, the less protection you have, or the more protection you give away, right? You limit your choices, and often, if you really want to balance the openness and the protection, it comes at a higher cost. Cost
Hmm.
of materials, cost of like programming, technology, to be able to actually protect that space and leave it feeling open and accessible, right?
Oh,
And
man.
I think that's not far off from where we are as humans either.
Which call with this whole transparency vulnerability things kind of calls out something deeper, is this issue of fear related to openness, right?
Yep.
Like that we walk into this tension necessarily so,
Yeah.
but how do we do that well? Is I just hope that we open up a real conversation, a transparent conversation about that. Like
Well, I think it starts. I mean, you should ask yourself the question, maybe even look in the mirror and just say, what am I hiding from these people? And
mm,
because we hide different things about ourselves from different people within our sphere of influence, within our walks of life.
mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm.
why? Why am I hiding these things? Right?
Yeah.
And come to grips with what could happen, what you're afraid will happen, and then what most likely will happen. I do a lot of public speaking, some motivational speaking, keynote speaking, um, and the best talks that I give, somehow I end up getting slightly emotional,
Yeah.
and like you can almost see like people that know me are like, oh, Tim's right on the brink, right? And I pull myself back and everything, but the audience feels, sees, and responds so well to that, and yet so many people, they're afraid of that. Like,
Yeah.
oh, like can I get myself to the brink of being emotional, and what will people think of me? But it
Yeah.
rarely, it rarely goes the way people are afraid it will go.
It reminds me of when I did my first TED talk and my coach said, and I had to unpack this because I got emotional when I did my practice run.
Yeah,
And he said, your transparency, or he said, your vulnerability and your transparency, he said, those are your superpowers.
for
And I
sure.
was like, I kind of had to think about what he meant by that. Like, and I don't think he meant like embrace it. He was encouraging me. And then I almost like that first TED talk, I kind of started to cry at the end. And it wasn't, it was like, it was weird. This thing overwhelmed me with what I felt on my heart. And so I'm like, I don't know, but I could say to myself, like, that doesn't happen in those kinds of talks. So don't do that. And then our protection, whenever it happens, sometimes we apologize. Oh, I'm sorry, I got emotional.
And the other thing is, with this fourth tenant,
Yeah.
oversharing, right? This is kind of the opposite, right? To where vulnerability is we're closed off, but there's some people that just will share everything. It kind of makes me laugh because right now it's really in vogue to say, be your authentic self, bring your authentic self to work. And then some people show up and you're like, whoa, hey, there's some things you should really leave at home. Like you shouldn't bring everything here, right? And
Right.
so like, what's that balance?
And how do you know? Like, this was to put this one in the list was it felt a little bit kind of surface. It didn't feel like it had the same depth. But then I thought there are people who confuse like intentional transparency with compulsion. Like where it's not really a choice, that's just what they do. Um, and where is it really transparent if you're just kind of just a lot of words? You know what I
I
mean?
think I think it goes back to like purpose and intention. When I walk into a situation, a conversation, whatever, what is my purpose for me and for you?
Yeah.
Like,
It's
why are
good.
we even here right now?
Yeah.
And I think that really does guide meaningful transparency
Yeah.
versus just oversharing information that maybe is unnecessary or even sometimes uncomfortable.
Yeah. Like transparency probably in the best cases is an intention, right? It's an intentional thing as opposed to a compulsion. Like it's a
It,
choice. That's when it's powerful. Is like I'm at this
yeah,
crossroads, and is it gonna? Okay, I'm gonna share this.
yep. And sometimes, going back to that vulnerability,
Yeah.
if you set an intention and a purpose for the transparency, you're more likely to be transparent in a way that adds to the situation and enriches the experience of people around you.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Man, there's some things to process in this.
Here we go. All right, Rob. See you next time, man.
Sounds good.
Bye.